£40,000, the young man said, loudly enough for the whole pump room to hear it, and a house in town. No man alive would blame me, and I will not be lectured by a physician's daughter with 3 gowns. The water in the glass Cashin Marek was holding tasted of iron and old pennies, and he had come to Belcaster to look at a farm, and he had not the smallest wish to be present at another man's disgrace. But the colonnade was crowded, and the band had stopped between airs, and there was nowhere on earth to look except at the 2 people standing under the second arch. So he looked, and afterwards he was very glad of it, because it decided the whole of the rest of his life. The young man was perhaps 26, handsome in a soft-chinned way, with a coat cut better than his prospects and a great deal of color in his face. The woman facing him was small and straight, in a gray pelisse that had been turned at the cuffs, with a portfolio of papers held against her breast like a shield, and she was not raising her voice at all. "I have not lectured you," she said. "I have asked you a question, twice. Did you write to Miss Hensley's father on the 8th of this month?" "Clemency." "On the 8th, because on the 9th you sat in my aunt's parlor and drank 2 cups of her tea and told me that you would speak to the trustees about the marriage settlement in the spring, and my aunt gave you the last of the sugar." Her chin came up an inch. "I do not mind the £40,000. I want that understood here, since you have chosen here. Any man may change his mind, and a poor man may need money, and I have no more claim on your heart than any woman has who was fool enough to believe a thing said in a garden. But you drank her tea on the 9th. That is a different order of thing altogether, Peregrine, and it is the only part of this that I shall remember when I am old." Somebody behind Cashin said, in the delighted whisper of a woman who has waited all season for exactly this, "That is the Ardley girl. Dead physician. Nothing but an annuity." "Then take your letters," the young man said, thrusting a packet at her, "and have the goodness not to make a scene." Clemency Ardley looked at the packet, and at him, and did not take it. "They are yours," she said. "You wrote them. I burned mine last night, which is the only piece of foresight I have shown in 11 months. She inclined her head, exactly as far as courtesy required and no farther. "I wish you joy of the lady, and I mean that, because she has done nothing to me and she will have to live with you. Good morning." And she walked out of the pump room at Belcaster, through about 200 people who had every one of them stopped talking, with a portfolio under her arm and her back straight, past the band, past the subscription book, past the 2 liveried men at the door who did not quite know whether to bow. Cashin set down his glass of chalybeate water and went after her, and did not entirely know why. He found her in the lower colonnade, out of sight of the windows, holding on to the pillar with one hand. He had seen men do that after bad news at sea. He recognized it, the particular blank stillness of a person who is not weeping because weeping would require a decision, and he stopped 4 feet away and said, in the flattest and most ordinary voice he could produce, "There is a chair behind you, ma'am. Nobody can see it from the room." She turned her head. "Are you a great deal of a gentleman," she said, "or a very small amount of one? Because if you are a great deal I shall have to be gracious, and I have not got it." "I am a land agent," said Cashin Marek. Something in her face eased about 1/4 of an inch. "Then I will sit down," she said, and did, and the portfolio slid off her lap and went across the flagstones in a fan. He knelt and gathered it. 20 or 30 sheets, and he had them in his hands for perhaps a minute and a half, and in that minute and a half his understanding of the morning rearranged itself entirely, because they were not a young lady's album drawings. They were botanical plates, pen and watercolor on good paper, each one with the plant entire root, stem, leaf, flower, a dissected corolla in the corner, a seed magnified, and beneath each, in a firm small hand, the name in Latin and in English and in the local dialect, the soil, the month, the situation, and a line or two of use. Water Avens. Belcaster, wet meadow below the tan yard, June. Root infused for a lax bowel. The country people call it Herb Bennett and are wrong. 20 of them. 30. He turned up one of a foxglove that stopped him where he knelt, because he had seen the plates in the great county floras in his own library, and he had never seen a better one. "You may give those back now," she said. "Who did these?" "I did." "Under whose instruction?" "My father's until I was 15, and then nobody's." She took them from him and squared the edges on her knee. "He was a physician here for 19 years. He drew his own plates because he could not afford books, and he taught me to grind colors before he taught me to write. And when he died, I found that a physician's practice cannot be inherited by a daughter, and a portfolio of drawings is worth about 11 shillings. She stood up. "Thank you for the chair. And for not saying anything kind, which I could not have borne." She was 3 steps away when Cashin heard himself say, "The plates are worth a great deal more than 11 shillings, and if any bookseller in this town has told you otherwise, he is either a fool or a thief." She stopped and looked back at him, really looked, for the first time, at the plain brown coat and the good boots, and the hands of a man who spent his life out of doors. And he was aware, with an odd and specific discomfort, of exactly how much he was not telling her simply by standing there. "What is your name?" she said. "Marek." "Mr. Marek," a very small bow of the head, "you are the only person in Belcaster this morning who has looked at the drawings instead of at me. I shall probably remember that too." Then she was gone up the steps into the street, and Cashin Marek, 9th Duke of Halloway, stood in the colonnade of a spa town in a coat he had bought for 4 guineas, and understood that he was in a great deal of trouble. He had been the Duke of Halloway for 2 years and 1 month, and he had been a land agent for 12 years before that, and he considered the second the honest half of his life. His father had been a younger son's younger son, a naval surgeon who had died at Guernsey when Cashin was 9. His mother had brought him home to a cottage on £80 a year and had made him read. At 19, he had gone as underagent to a Wiltshire estate at £40 in his keep, and at 24, he was managing 11,000 acres for a marquis who never came near them. And at 32, he was the best-known land agent west of Salisbury and perfectly content. And he had loved a girl at Chidbury and been refused by her father on the grounds, accurately stated, in the man's own study, with the door open, that an agent is a servant with a horse. Then, in 11 months, the 8th Duke's 2 sons had died of the same fever at school, and the 8th Duke had gone the following February, and a cousin at Naples had gone in the June, and a firm of attorneys had written to a land agent at Chidbury to inform him that he was the 9th Duke of Halloway Abbey, with 14,000 acres, a house in town, an income he had spent a fortnight refusing to believe, and a seat in the House of Lords. He had been 36. He had gone up to look at the abbey, and the servants had lined the hall, and the agent, his own kind, a good man named Quill, had brought him the books, and Cashin had done the only thing he knew how to do and had read them, all of them, for 11 days, and had found 400 things wrong. And then the visiting had begun. That was the part nobody warned a man about. Within 6 weeks, he had been invited to 11 houses he had previously entered by the back passage, and every one of them had a daughter, and every one of the daughters had been schooled. He had sat through 9 dinners and had counted, at the 9th, the number of true sentences addressed to him in an evening, and the number was 2, and one of them was about the weather. He had gone home to the abbey and stood in a gallery hung with 4 generations of Mareks, and understood, with perfect clarity and no self-pity at all. That the one thing his 40,000 a year had purchased was the permanent impossibility of being told the truth. So he had begun traveling as Mr. Merrick, land agent. It had started as a state business and become something else. He went twice a year now, put on the brown coat, took a hired horse and a portmanteau and Quill's letter of authority in his pocket, and went and looked at farms he meant to buy, and drank in tap rooms, and listened to what tenants said about the Duke of Halloway when they did not know they were saying it to him. He had learned more in 6 such journeys than in 2 years of reports. He had also learned that nobody, in 12 years or in 6 journeys, had ever once looked at him the way the whole county now looked at him, and that he liked being a land agent very much, and that this was a thing about himself he had not fully examined. He was in Belcaster to buy Nethercott. It was 240 acres of good south-facing land 9 miles from the Abbey, with an old farmhouse of grey stone and a walled garden gone to seed, and it belonged to the Halloway Charitable Trust, and the trust had let it go to ruin for 11 years, because the trust was administered by a committee in London that had never seen it. Cashin meant to take it out of the trust at a full valuation, put it in order at his own charge, and put it back. He had come to walk it, alone, in October, and had put up at the Cross Keys as Mr. Merrick, and had gone to the pump room on the second morning purely because it was raining. He walked out to Nethercott that afternoon and did not see 1 acre of it. He saw a grey police turned at the cuffs. He heard a woman saying, "You drank her tea on the 9th." He thought about a foxglove plate with a dissected Corolla in the corner, drawn by somebody who had had no instruction since she was 15, and about 11 shillings. He did not at that stage imagine that he might marry her. He was 36 and had a great deal of practice at not imagining things. What he thought, standing in the ruined walled garden at Nethercott with the rain coming on and 11 years of bindweed round his boots, was that a walled garden of that aspect, 400 feet of it, south and west, with 2 lean-to frames and a well, was the best physic ground he had seen in the county, and that it was a scandal it should be growing nettles. He was still thinking it 3 days later, when the Belcaster and County Bank stopped payment. He heard it in the tap room at 8 in the morning. By 9 there were 60 people in the street outside the bank's door in Cross Street, standing very quietly, which was worse than shouting. By noon there were 300, and the shutters were up, and a clerk had put a paper on the door in a copperplate hand, regretting the temporary suspension of business. Cashin stood in the crowd in his brown coat and listened, because that was what the brown coat was for. £1,100 of the Friendly Society. All Mr. Tuffin's savings, and he's 70. They say the London house is gone too, and there's paper of theirs out in Bristol. The little annuities is what'll kill 'em. The little annuities. Half the widows in this town had their money with Henslay's bank. Cashin turned his head. Henslay's. Hensley, Truscott, and Pine, sir, as was. The man spat. Old Henslay's been dead 11 year, but the name's over the door. His granddaughter's the heiress. They've all been chasing this season 40,000, they said. Well, he nodded at the shuttered windows. There's 40,000 for you. It took Cashin 4 hours and 2 calls to establish the rest of it, and every step of it was uglier than the last. The Ardley annuity, £210 a year, being the whole of what a careful physician had been able to leave a sister and a daughter, had been placed with the Belcaster and County Bank because the physician had attended the family for 19 years and trusted them. It was gone. Not suspended. Gone, in the particular way that money is gone when a country bank has been discounting its own director's paper for 4 years. And Mr. Peregrine Locksley's engagement to Miss Arabella Hensley had been announced in the pump room on the 21st of October, and the bank had shut its doors on the 24th, and there was not a soul in Belcaster who believed that the young man had not known which way the wind sat when he wrote to her father on the 8th. Cashin walked up and down the wet street outside the Cross Keys for the better part of an hour that evening, and then he went in and wrote to Quill. He wrote the letter 3 times. The third version was 11 lines long and said, in substance, that Mr. Merrick would remain at Belcaster a fortnight longer, that the Nethercot purchase should proceed, but the conveyance should be made out in the name of Cashin Merrick, gentleman, of Belcaster, and not otherwise, since the Trust's committee would raise objections if they knew the buyer and Quill was to let them raise them to him. That Quill should send down £200 in notes of the Bristol Bank, and not of any London house. And that Quill was not, on any account whatever, to write to him at the Cross Keys as anything but Mr. Merrick, and had better burn this. He sat looking at it for some time, and then he added a postscript, and the postscript was the honest part of the letter, and he knew it while he was writing it. You will ask me what I am doing, and I shall tell you when I know. There is a young woman in this town whose father was a physician, and whose annuity was in the bank that shut on Tuesday. She has an aunt of 61, and no other relation living. She was thrown over in a public room 3 days ago by a man who had already written to a richer girl's father, and she stood up under it in a way I have not seen a grown man manage. She draws the best botanical plates I have handled outside a great library, and she has had no instruction since she was 15. She spoke to me for 4 minutes, in the belief that I was a land agent, and it was the only conversation I have had in 2 years and 1 month in which nobody was calculating anything. I am aware of every objection you are about to make, Quill, and I have made them all myself twice, and I am going to walk out to Nethercot in the morning and look at the walled garden again, which will tell you exactly how much good the objections have done. The sale was on the Thursday, at Guthrie's rooms behind the Corn Exchange, and Cashin went to it in his brown coat and stood at the back with his hat in his hand. The advertisement had said the entire library, cabinet, and effects of the late William Ardley, Esquire, surgeon and physician, of Belcaster, and it had been put in by the aunt, and it was, Cashin understood before the third lot, the last thing in the house that could be turned into money. They sold the books in bundles of 9 and 11. 200 volumes of medicine and natural history went in 40 minutes for £18. They sold the mahogany instrument case, and the microscope, and a good brass balance, and the physician's chair. They sold Lot 41, a cabinet of pressed plants in 9 drawers, being a herbarium of the flora of this county collected over 22 years, and there was no bidder at all, until a bookseller from Bath offered £2.10, and got it, and made a face as though he had done somebody a favor. And they sold, at Lot 44, 4 bound quarto volumes described in the catalogue as manuscript daybooks and case notes of the late Mr. Ardley, of no interest to the general purchaser, and they went for 11 shillings to a young woman in a black bonnet sitting, bolt upright in the second row, who was the only person in the room who bid for them, and who had to count the money out of a reticule in coppers and sixpences, while 300 people watched. Clemency Ardley did not look round once. Cashin stayed to the end. He bought nothing, because a strange man buying up her father's effects in front of her would have been the cruelest thing anybody did to her that month, and he had at least understood that. But he went to the bookseller from Bath in the yard afterwards, and gave him £4 for the herbarium cabinet with instructions to hold it at his lodging and say nothing. And he wrote down, from the auctioneer's book, the name and direction of every purchaser of every lot, which took him 20 minutes and cost him a shilling, and he put the list in his pocket-book. Then he walked up Cross Street and knocked at the door of number 11, and asked for Miss Drusilla Ardley. The parlor had a good carpet and no chairs to speak of. There was a mark on the wall where a bookcase had stood for 19 years. Miss Drusilla Ardley was 61, upright, deaf in the left ear, and had the particular ferocious politeness of a gentlewoman who has been making calculations all night. "Mr. Merrick, Clemency spoke of you, the gentleman in the colonnade." "I have come on a matter of business, ma'am, and I am aware that this is an intrusion, and I will be as short as I can be." Cashin remained standing. "I am employed in the management of estates in this county. One of them holds a farm at Nethercott, 9 miles west, which I am to put in order. There is a walled garden there of 400 feet, south and west, with a well and 2 frames, and it has been growing nettles for 11 years. I saw Miss Ardley's plates last week, and I have been to Guthrie's this morning, and watched a cabinet of 22 years' work sold for £2.10. He set his hat on the table. "I want to know what your circumstances are, and I want you to tell me the truth of them, because I cannot do anything useful with a polite version." Miss Drusilla looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down, which was a kind of answer. "The truth of them," she said, "is that we have £11, this house until Lady Day, and no income whatever. My brother's annuity was in the bank. Clemency has been offered a situation as governess to 4 girls near Ripon at £18 and her board, which she will take, and she will send me 9 of the 18, and I shall go to my cousin at Taunton who does not want me, and will say so daily for the rest of my life." She folded her hands. "And Mr. Sowerby, the apothecary in 4th Street, who is 52 and a decent man and buried his wife in the spring, has called twice this week and made it perfectly plain, and Clemency will not have him, and I have not the heart to press her, and I ought to press her, and I have lain awake 3 nights over it. There. Is that unpolite enough for you?" "Yes," said Cashin. "Thank you. Where is she?" "In the garden. There is nothing left in the house to occupy her." The old woman's mouth worked once. "She has been potting up her father's cuttings, Mr. Merrick, in old teacups, because she cannot bear to leave them, and she cannot take them to Ripon, and she does not know what she means to do with them, and neither do I." He found her at the end of 40 feet of town garden, on her knees on a sack, with about 30 cuttings in cups and jars, and broken pots ranged along a wall, and her sleeves pushed back, and her hands black to the wrist. She looked up. She did not get up. "Mr. Merrick, you were at Guthrie's." "I was." "I saw you." She pushed a strand of hair off her forehead with the back of her wrist. "I hoped you were the bookseller from Bath, and then I saw you were not bidding, and I was glad, and then I was ashamed of being glad, because somebody ought to have bid for that cabinet, and the somebody ought to have been me." Her voice was perfectly steady. Her hands, he noticed, were not. £2.10, 9 drawers. He would go out at 5 in the morning in August to get a specimen at the right hour. "The cabinet is at my lodging," said Cashin. "I gave the man £4 for it in the yard. It is yours whenever you want it, and there is no obligation of any kind, and I have not the least idea what to do about the fact that I have just made that a great deal harder for you rather than easier, which I did not think through, and I am sorry." Clemency Ardley sat back on her heels and looked at him, and for a moment he could not read her face at all. "Why?" she said. "Because it was 22 years of somebody's life, and it went for the price of a hat." "That is not why. That is a reason. There is a difference, and I have had a very educational month." She got up and wiped her hands on her apron and faced him across the potting board. "Say the actual thing, Mr. Merrick, whatever it is. I am past being managed. I was managed for 11 months in a garden by a young man who was writing to somebody else, and I have not the constitution for another course of it." So he said it, standing among the teacups, in a 40-foot garden in Belcaster, with no preparation whatever, and made a considerable mess of it. I am 36. I have a competence and no debts and no family living. I have a farm coming into my hands at Nethercott, 9 miles from here, 240 acres, with a stone house of 11 rooms in bad repair and the walled garden I described to your aunt. I need a wife, for reasons I will state plainly if you will let me. And you need a roof for yourself and for Miss Ardley, and £18 a year in Yorkshire is not a roof, it is a postponement. He drew breath. So I am asking you to marry me, and I am asking it 4 days after we met, in a garden, having watched your father's cabinet sold, which makes it very nearly indecent, and I know it. And if the answer is no, I shall leave the cabinet at your aunt's door tomorrow and go away and not trouble you again. The wind moved in the wall creeper. Somewhere over the roofs, the Belcaster church clock struck the half. "Reasons," said Clemency. "Ma'am, you said you needed a wife for reasons you would state plainly. State them." She had gone very calm, in the way he was learning to recognize as her form of alarm. "Because I have had one offer of marriage this month from Mr. Sowerby, who wants a nurse for his mother and somebody to make up his powders, and he had the honesty to say so, and I respected him for it. And I have had one engagement broken by a young man who wanted £40,000. So do not tell me you are in love with me, Mr. Merrick, because I shall know it is a lie, and I would rather have Mr. Sowerby's version than a pretty one." Cashin Merrick had spent 12 years telling landowners things they did not wish to hear, and 2 years learning to say nothing at all, and he found that the second had entirely destroyed his practice at the first. "Then here is the version," he said. "I am not in love with you. I have known you 4 days. I should think very poorly of any man who claimed otherwise, and so, plainly, would you. What is true is this. I have spent my whole life in the employment of people who talk to me according to what they think I can do for them, and I have got very used to it, and about 3 months ago I noticed that I had stopped listening to anybody at all. Then you asked a young man in a public room whether he had written a letter on the 8th, and you did it without raising your voice, and you told him you did not mind the £40,000, and I believed you. And in the colonnade you asked me whether I was a great deal of a gentleman or a small amount of one, because you had not got the strength to be gracious." He stopped and made himself go on. "I have been thinking about that sentence for 4 days. I am asking you to marry me because I would like to live in a house where somebody says things like that, and because I am not able to be certain of finding another woman in England who would, and because at 36, a man who has found the thing he wants and does not ask for it deserves what he gets." She was silent for a long time. "That," she said at last, "is the strangest offer I expect to receive in my life." "Yes. It is also the first honest thing any man has said to me since my father died." She picked up a teacup with a rooted cutting in it and set it down again, apparently at random. "I have 3 questions." "Ask them." "Are you married, or promised, or in any way encumbered with a woman anywhere in England?" "No, on my honor, no, and you may write to my employer's attorney and ask. I will give you his name." "Have you any expectation that I shall be idle? Because I have kept my father's account since I was 13, and made his tinctures since I was 15, and I do not know how to sit in a parlor, and I have discovered this month that it is the only thing in my whole education that is worth anything, and I will not be put in a chair with a work-basket." "There are 240 acres of it," said Cashin, "and a physic garden growing nettles, and 11 rooms with the damp in 9 of them, and I shall be out of the house from 6 in the morning. If you want idleness, you had far better take Mr. Sowerby." Something happened at the corner of her mouth that was very nearly a smile. "Third," she looked straight at him, "is there anything about yourself that you are not telling me?" Cashin Merrick, 9th Duke of Halloway, stood in a physician's back garden in Belcaster with a woman's whole future in his hands, and had the truth in his mouth, and did not say it. He has never been able in all the years since to reconstruct the reasoning of the 4 seconds that followed, because there was no reasoning in it. There was only a very clear picture, arriving whole, himself saying the word Halloway, and her face changing, and everything that had happened in that garden becoming, instantly and irreversibly, something else. She would say yes. That was the horror of it. A woman with 11 pounds and no income does not refuse a duke, and she would know she had not refused him, and she would never afterwards know whether she had chosen anything at all, and neither would he. There is a great deal, he said. None of it is a wife or a debt or a crime. Some of it is family, and some of it is business, and one part of it is a piece of property I am ashamed of, and I will tell you every word of it. And I am asking you to let me choose the hour, and I am aware that I have no right whatever to ask that of you 4 days after Mr. Locksley. Clemency hardly considered him. You could have said no, she said. Yes. You did not. No. Very well. She wiped her palm once more on her apron and held out her hand to him, black to the wrist and quite steady now. Then I will marry you, Mr. Merrick, on those terms, and you may choose your hour, and I will tell you what I shall be watching for. Not the secret. Every family has those, and I do not much care. I shall be watching whether you tell me before I could have found it out, or after. That is the whole difference between my father and Mr. Locksley, and it is the only test I have. He took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her. Miss Ardley, he said, I should like to tell you that you will find me equal to that. Yes, she said, I noticed you did not. There were 11 days between the garden and the church, and Cashin spent all of them in a state he could only compare to the week before an examination. She wrote for a character, of course. He had offered the name himself, standing among the teacups, because refusing would have been unthinkable, and he had been careful to offer it in exactly the form that would answer. Mr. Tobias Quill, land agent of Nether Halloway in this county, agent to the Duke of Halloway, who has known me 19 years and will tell you the truth about me. She wrote the same evening. He knew she had, because he saw the letter in the tray at the Cross Keys with his own eyes at 7 the next morning, and stood looking at it for the better part of a minute, and could have taken it, and did not. Quill's reply came on the 4th day, and Clemency read it out to him in her aunt's parlor, with the sort of dry amusement that he was beginning to find he would have crossed a county for. He says that he has known you 19 years, since you came into the county as an underagent at 40 pounds and your keep. He says that you are the best judge of land west of Salisbury, and the worst judge of your own comfort. He says you have no debts of any kind and never have had, that you do not drink or game, and that you once sat up 3 nights with a tenant's sick horse, and then charged the estate for the corn. He says, she turned the sheet, that your means are entirely sufficient for the establishment you propose and considerably more, that you are honorable in all your dealings, and that if I have any doubt whatever I should apply to him again, and he will answer any question I put to him in writing. She folded it. It is the most extraordinary reference I have ever seen. It has no adjectives in it at all until the last line. What is the last line? He is the only man of my acquaintance who deserves to be happy, and has taken no steps whatever towards it in 19 years. And if you can mend that, madam, I shall be obliged to you as long as I live. Cashin looked at the fire, and thought about the fact that Quill had contrived to write 400 words about him, without one syllable that was false, and without the one word that mattered, and that Quill had done it out of loyalty, and that he had made an accomplice of the most honest man he knew inside a fortnight. He is 50, he said, and sentimental, and you are not to encourage him." "I shall write and thank him," said Clemency, "and I shall keep his letter, because it is the only document in my possession that says anything good about my prospects." Mr. Sowerby, the apothecary, called on the 7th day. Cashin was in the room. There had been no way to avoid it without rudeness, and Miss Drusilla had gone out for the express purpose of not being there, which fooled nobody. He was a heavy, gray, careful man of 52 in a good black coat, and he stood with his hat in both hands and said what he had come to say without any preliminaries whatever. "Miss Ardley, I am told you are to be married on the 11th, and I have come to say that I am glad of it, which is not what I expected to be saying when I got up this morning, and I have made myself walk here rather than think better of it." He turned the hat once. "I asked you twice, and I was not delicate about it, and I have thought since that a woman of 23 who has just been used as you were used in the pump room had better not be asked anything by anybody for 6 months. I ask your pardon for that. Mr. Sowerby, there is one other thing, and then I shall go." He looked at Cashin for the first time, steadily, and Cashin had the uncomfortable sense of being weighed by a man who weighed things for a living. "Your father, madam, made up his own preparations for 19 years, and there was not a physician in this county fit to be spoken of in the same day. When he died I bought his shop stock at the valuation, and I have had the use of his formulas ever since, and I have made money out of them, and you have had 11 shillings worth of his handwriting off an auctioneer. That is the law, and it is a poor law, and I am not going to make a speech about it. But if ever you want anything out of that shop, anything, sir, at any hour, and I include the London drugs and the balance and the still, you have only to send, and there will be no bill." He put his hat on and went out, and Cashin stood in the window and watched him go down Cross Street and said, "That is a considerable man." "Yes," said Clemency, "and in 11 days I have refused the best offer in Belcaster and accepted a stranger who will not tell me what he is keeping in his coat, and I am perfectly aware of how that will read in the town, and I find I do not care in the least, which is either courage or a fever." He took her out to Nethercot on the 9th day, in a hired gig in the rain. He had been dreading it. He had walked that farm 4 times by then with a valuer's eye, and knew exactly what it was. 240 acres in fair heart and bad heart by turns, a house with the damp in 9 rooms, 11 years of a London committee's neglect in every gate and gutter. He watched her face all the way up the lane and could not read one thing in it, and at the yard he handed her down and said, before she could speak, "It is worse than I have described it. The chimneys smoke, the back stairs are rotten in 3 treads, and there is no water in the house. It is all carried from the well in the garden." Clemency Ardley stood in the yard of Nethercot in the rain, and looked at 11 rooms of grey stone, with the guttering gone, and a jackdaw's nest in the kitchen chimney. "Show me the garden," she said. He took her through the arch in the wall. 400 feet of it, south and west, 11 feet high, brick, with a lean-to frame at each end and the well in the middle, and a pear tree gone wild along 30 feet of the south face, and every inch of the ground under bindweed and elder and nettle to the height of a man's chest, and the frames without a whole pane in them, and the paths gone. She did not say anything for a long time. She walked out along what had been the central path, in the wet, holding her skirt up in one hand, all the way to the far end and back, and stopped at the well and put her hand flat on the coping. Then she said, "Mr. Marrick, do you know what this is?" "It is a walled garden of 400 feet with a south and west aspect and a well, and it has been growing nettles for 11 years, and I said to your aunt on Tuesday that it was a scandal, and she thought I was making conversation." "It is my father's whole life," said Clemency, "if he had ever had £11 to spare in 19 years. She turned round, and there were tears on her face at last, the first he had seen, and they were not for Locksley, and not for the auction. He used to say that the reason the country people do themselves harm is not ignorance, it is distance, she said. You cannot tell a woman with 4 in the house and a mile to the pump to send 11 miles to Belcaster for a dram of anything. You have to grow it where she lives and know what it is, and know what it does and write it down. And he had a garden of 40 feet behind a house in Cross Street, and he grew 9 things in it, and he taught me all 9. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand exactly as she had over the potting board. This wall would hold rosemary. Along there, it would hold 111 feet of rosemary, and it would come through any winter in this county. And there is thyme ground under that nettle, do you see the stone? And I could have 300 seedlings in the frames by March if I could get glass. Cashin Marek stood in the rain in a ruined garden, and made himself say the entirely honest sentence that was in his mouth, because it was very nearly the last chance he had to say an honest thing without saying all of it. You may have the whole of it, he said, and every penny that comes out of that farm above what it costs to run, and I will carry stone and dig and glaze, and I will not touch one bed of it or plant one thing in it without asking you first, and I will put it in writing on Thursday if you like. He looked away, down the wall. And I want you to understand that I have not the smallest notion how to be married, and that I am not a clever man about people, and that I shall get a great many things wrong. But I have spent 19 years putting land into order that belonged to other men. If you will tell me what you want in this garden, I can do it. It is the one thing I am certain of. Clemency looked at him across the wellhead for a long moment. That, she said, is a better proposal than the first one. And she put out her hand, and he took it. And they stood there in the wet with 11 years of bindweed round their boots for rather longer than either of them afterwards admitted. They were married at St. Ninian's in Belcaster on the 11th of November at 9 in the morning, by license, with 4 people present. Cashin had thought a great deal about the license, and had done the thing that seemed at the time to be merely careful, and was in fact the single most expensive act of his life. He had gone to the surrogate's office at the county town and sworn the affidavit, and had himself described as Cashin Marek, gentleman, of the parish of Belcaster, bachelor, of full age, every word of which was true, and not one word of which was the truth. And he had paid the fees and folded the paper into his pocketbook, and told himself that a man's name is his name. Quill came down for it. Cashin had written to him a second time, more fully, and Quill had ridden 110 miles in 2 days to stand in the vestry of St. Ninian's and argue with him for 40 minutes before the service. You cannot marry a young woman under a name she does not know is a fiction. It is not a fiction, it is my name. It is a quarter of your name, and you know it. Quill was 50, grey, and had managed Halloway for 19 years, and was the only man in England who spoke to Cashin as he had spoken to him when Cashin was an underagent at £40. Your Grace, no, you shall hear it, and then I will hold my tongue for the rest of my life if you like. If you tell her this morning, she may be angry and she will marry you anyway, and in 10 years it will be a story you tell at your own table. If you tell her in a month, it will be a wound, and it will heal. If she finds it out from a stranger, it will not heal, not ever, not entirely, and I have seen it happen to a better marriage than yours is going to be at the start. Cashin stood at the vestry window and looked out at the rain on the churchyard. Tell me the other thing, he said, the legal thing. You have been holding it since the porch. Quill let out a breath. The description in the affidavit, Marek, gentleman of Belcaster. There is authority, old authority, and it is bad law, and I would not lose an hour's sleep over it in an ordinary case. That a marriage by license may be voidable if the parties are described falsely with intent to conceal, And there was a case in the last century where a peer married under his family name, and the marriage was questioned by the next heir. Questioned and upheld. But the questioning went on for 4 years, and it destroyed the woman. "You are telling me to go out there and put it off." "I am telling you," said Quill, "that you are about to hand your enemies a stick, and you have not the faintest notion yet how many enemies you have, because you have been Duke of Halloway for 2 years, and you have been kind to everybody and refused everybody, and that is how a man collects them." The clock struck. Cashin put his hand on the door. "After the service," he said, "you will go back to the Abbey, and you will have the north wing shut and the Nethercot house made ready in my name, and you will write to me as Mr. Merrick. And Quill, thank you. You are right, and I am going to do it anyway, and you may enter that in the books." She came up the aisle in gray, on her aunt's arm, with a bunch of rosemary and late chrysanthemums in her hand out of the 40-foot garden. And Cashin Merrick turned round and saw her, and stopped being able to breathe properly for about 11 seconds, and understood, with the particular helpless clarity of a man who has just been very careful about a license, that he had not the smallest idea what he had begun. She said the words steadily. She had a hand that shook when he put the ring on it, and a voice that did not. Miss Drusilla wept audibly from the beginning of the service to the end of it. Quill signed the register as a witness and looked at nobody. And outside in the porch in the rain, 3 or 4 people from Cross Street had gathered to see, and one of them, an old woman in a shawl who had been the physician's patient for 19 years, took Clemency's face in both hands and said, "He'd have liked this, my duck. He never could abide that Locksley boy," which made her laugh and cry in the same breath and was, Cashin thought afterwards, worth more than any of the 14,000 acres. They drove to Nethercot the same afternoon. Himself, his wife, her aunt, a herbarium cabinet of 9 drawers, and 30 rooted cuttings in teacups packed in straw in a fish crate. The first 4 months at Nethercot were the happiest Cashin Merrick had ever had, and he knew it while they were happening, which is not usual. The house was cold and the chimneys smoked, and the back stairs had rot in 3 treads. There were 2 servants, Mrs. Pike, who came from the village and cooked, and a boy called Ned who did everything else, and a farm bailiff of 60 named Hurdle who had been running the place down for 11 years on the trust's instructions, and who wept, actually wept, in the yard on the second day when Cashin told him there was money for lime. They worked, that was the shape of it. Cashin was out at 6, there were 400 yards of hedge to lay, a cow-house to re-roof, 11 acres of couch grass to break up, and a valuation to write. Clemency was in the walled garden by 7 with Ned and a bill hook, and she took that garden apart in 3 weeks. 11 years of bindweed and elder out, the well cleaned, the frames reglazed pane by pane with glass she bought as broken lots in Belcaster at a penny a pound, and the cuttings out of the teacups and into the south wall by the end of the month. By February she had a physic bed 40 feet long, and a nursery of 200 seedlings, and a list. The list was the thing that undid him. She kept it in a marbled notebook, every plant, its date, its situation, its progress, and against certain of them a name and a village. Mrs. Hurdle, ague. Widow Tap at the mill, her leg. The Boulies, 5 in the house and the cough all winter. She had begun, within 6 weeks of arriving in a parish where she knew nobody, to be the person the parish came to, not as a lady with a basket, which the county understood, but as a physician's daughter who ground her own colors, and knew what a foxglove would and would not do, and who said, flatly and often, that a case wanted a surgeon, and not her. "You should not do it for nothing," he said to her one evening in February. They were in the kitchen, because it was the only warm room, with the accounts on one end of the table and her marbled book on the other, and Miss Drusilla asleep, by the fire with her mouth open. There are 11 families in this parish who could pay you 6 pence and would think better of themselves for it. I know. She was ruling a line. I have thought about it and I cannot see how to begin. If I take 6 pence, I am an apothecary practicing without indentures, and Mr. Sowerby's whole trade would be within his rights to have me before the magistrates. And if I take nothing, I am a lady with a basket, which is contemptible. Then what is the third thing? There is no third thing. There is only the thing I want, which is impossible. She set down the pen. I want a dispensary, 2 rooms and a stove and a proper stock, and a surgeon in attendance 1 day in the week, paid, and a penny subscription from every family in 3 parishes, so that nobody is receiving charity. My father wanted it here for 19 years. It wants £200 to begin, and 40 a year to keep. And there is not a soul within 11 miles who has £200 and the least interest in the health of a laborer. Cashin Merrick, who had £200 in his pocketbook and 40,000 a year in the funds, sat at his own kitchen table and said, "That is a great pity," and hated himself for 11 straight days afterwards. He tried to tell her 3 times. The first was in December on the hill above Nether Halloway, where the whole valley lay out below them in the frost, and the abbey showed through the bare trees 3 miles off, grey, enormous, 41 windows on the south front. She had stopped and looked at it and said, "Who lives there?" And he had said, "The Duke of Halloway," and she had said, "Have you ever seen him?" And he had said, "Yes," and she had said, "What is he like?" And there had been a moment, a whole open moment with nothing in it but frost and rooks, in which the thing could have been said in 9 words. "Ordinary," he said, "duller than they suppose." "How disappointing," said his wife, and put her hand through his arm, and they walked on, and he did not sleep that night. The second was in January, over a letter. Quill wrote every week, and Cashin read the letters in the barn and burned them, and one morning she came in with one in her hand that Ned had brought up from the post before he was down, and she was holding it out, and the seal was Quill's private seal, and not the estate's, which was the only reason the boy had not been struck by the coronet. "Your correspondent writes a great deal. Estate business. For a farm of 240 acres. She gave it to him without opening it and stood there a second longer than she needed to. "Cashin, you said you would choose your hour." "I did." "It has been 2 months. She was quite calm. "I am not pressing you. I am telling you that I have begun to invent things, and what I invent is worse than anything true is likely to be, and I would rather have the worst thing true than my own imagination for another month. That is all." That was the closest he came, and what stopped him was so small and so contemptible that he could hardly credit it afterwards. He looked at her standing in the doorway of the kitchen at Nethercot in an apron with her hair coming down and flour on one wrist, in a house of 11 rooms where she was entirely and visibly happy, and he thought, "If I say it now, this ends. Not the marriage. This. The kitchen, the 2 servants, the woman who tells me things because I am nobody." He was 36 years old, and he had been the 9th Duke of Halloway for 2 years and 3 months. And he had found the one place in England where he was not, and he could not make himself set fire to it. "Not today," he said. "Soon. I give you my word it will be soon, and it will be from me." The third time was in March, and it was very nearly taken out of his hands, because Lady Sabine Verrill's coachman missed the abbey turning in the fog, and came through Nether Halloway asking the way at the smithy. And the smith told her groom that the gentleman at Nethercot would know, being one of the Duke's people. And Cashin heard the carriage on the lane, and got to the gate in time to speak to the groom in the road, and send them on, and stood there, in the mud watching a coroneted panel go away up the lane. and turned round and found his wife in the gateway behind him with a trowel in her hand. "That was a coronet on the door," she said. "It was. Whose?" "Lady Sabine Verrill. She is a connection of the Halloway family." He heard his own voice, perfectly level. She was going to the Abbey and her man had missed the turn. "And she stopped here?" "She stopped at the smithy." Clemency looked at him for a long moment in the fog with the trowel in her hand, and then she said, "Very well," and went back into the walled garden, and did not speak more than 9 words to him for the rest of that day. And on the following morning she was as she always was, which was worse. The letter came on the 4th of April. He was in the 11-acre field with Hurdle and 2 hired men, breaking up the couch grass, in his shirt sleeves, with the first real warmth of the year on his back. And he saw Ned running along the headland with something white in his hand, and he knew before the boy was within 50 yards of him, because Ned was running. It was not from Quill. It was from Quill's London agents, and it had come by express, and it had been forwarded from the Abbey with a second cover in the steward's hand, and the seal on the inner letter was heavy black wax with the Halloway arms, and it had been opened and read by nobody, and Ned's eyes were enormous. "Beg pardon, sir. The man's in the yard and he's wanting an answer, and he called you your grace." He read it standing in the 11-acre field with the couch grass smoking on the fires behind him, and it was 4 pages, and the substance of it was in the second. The committee of the Halloway Charitable Trust, sitting in London on the 29th of March, had before them the conveyance of the farm and lands of Nethercot to one Cashin Marrick, gentleman, of Belcaster, and it had been represented to the committee by a member, and the member was named, and the name was Lady Sabine Verrill, that the said Cashin Marrick was in truth his Grace the Duke of Halloway, being himself the visitor and principal patron of the said trust, and that the sale was therefore a dealing by a trustee with the trust property, at a valuation procured by himself, under a description calculated to conceal his identity from the committee. The committee had resolved to take the opinion of counsel. Counsel's opinion, obtained on the 2nd of April and enclosed, was that the transaction was voidable, that no fraud need be shown, that the mere concealment was fatal, and that the matter would in all probability have to go before the court in Chancery, unless it were undone by consent. And in the 4th page, in the flat prose of a London attorney who had no notion he was writing anything of consequence, there was this, that the committee had also inquired whether the property was in occupation, and had been informed that it was occupied by Mr. Marrick, and by a lady described in the parish as his wife, and that the committee desired to be informed of the lady's name and the date and place of the marriage, and by what description his Grace had been married. Cashin folded the letter. He gave Ned a shilling and told him to take the express man into the kitchen and give him beer. He walked to the gate of the 11-acre field and stood there and looked down the lane at the gray roof of his own farmhouse and the top of the walled garden wall and the smoke going up out of the kitchen chimney. And he understood that he had 11 minutes, perhaps 20, and that he was going to spend them walking down a lane, and that there was no arrangement of words in the language that would make what came next anything other than what it was. He did not get the 11 minutes. He got about 4, because as he came into the yard, a traveling carriage came in behind him with 2 horses steaming, and the panel had a coronet on it, and Lady Sabine Verrill did not wait for the step. She was 54, small, exquisite, in dove gray with a black bonnet, and she came across the yard of Nethercot Farm looking about her with an interest so frank that it was almost innocent. "Halloway," she said, "I have been 3 hours from Belcaster, and I have had the most extraordinary morning. Do you know what the woman at the Cross Keys told me? She told me that Mr. Merrick, the land agent, married the poor Ardley girl in November and took her out to a farm. And I said, my good creature, that cannot be, because Mr. Merrick, the land agent, is the Duke of Halloway, and she laughed at me. She stopped in front of him and looked up. And here you are in your shirt sleeves with a hay fork. My dear man, it is worse than I hoped. Is she pretty? Cashin did not answer her, because his wife was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. Clemency had a basin in her hands. She had, he saw with terrible clarity, been shelling something into it, and there was a cloth over her shoulder, and her sleeves were up, and she had heard the whole of it, every word, from Halloway to Is she pretty? Because the yard at Nethercot is 19 feet across, and there was nothing in the world that morning but a blackbird and 2 steaming horses. She did not drop the basin. He would have preferred it if she had. She set it down on the bench beside the door very carefully, and took the cloth off her shoulder and folded it, and said, in a voice of ordinary politeness, "You will want the parlor, and there is no fire in it. Ned will bring one. Will your ladyship take tea?" "Well," said Lady Sabine with real appreciation. "Well, that is very good indeed. Yes, I will take tea, and you may sit down while I drink it, and I shall tell you what has been done to you, because it is very plain that he has not." "That will not be necessary," said Clemency. "I heard your ladyship in the yard. He is the Duke of Halloway." "He is." "Since when?" 2 years and 4 months. He came into it through a fever at a school and an old man's heart and a cousin who ate crayfish at Naples, which everybody said at the time was a judgment. Lady Sabine drew off her gloves finger by finger, watching. 14,000 acres, the Abbey, a house in Grosvenor Street, and somewhere between 38 and 42,000 a year. I have never been able to get the exact figure, and I have tried for 2 years. Also a seat in the House of Lords, in which he has spoken once, on drainage. My dear, you are the Duchess of Halloway. You have been the Duchess of Halloway since November, if the marriage is good, which is a question I am afraid we shall come to. There was a silence in the kitchen doorway at Nethercot that Cashin Merrick heard for the rest of his life. Then his wife looked at him, only at him, as though the small, exquisite woman in dove gray had ceased to be in the yard at all, and said, "Was it before or after?" He did not pretend not to understand. "After," he said. "I have known for 2 years and 4 months. I knew in your aunt's garden. I knew in the vestry of St. Ninian's, and Quill begged me to tell you before the service, and I would not. You could not have found it out. I took care of that. There is no version of this in which I come out anything but exactly what you think I am, and I am not going to attempt one." "Thank you," said Clemency Ardley. "That is at least efficient." And she walked past him, out of the kitchen door, across the yard, and out of the gate onto the lane, without a bonnet, in her working apron, and turned left, which was the road to Belcaster and 9 miles. He went after her, of course. He caught her at the second field gate. "Clemency, do not touch my arm." She did not shout it, and she did not stop walking, and he did not touch her arm. "You may walk beside me if you like. It is your lane, it is your road, I dare say it is your parish and your church and your bishop. I find I cannot look at anything in 9 miles without it turning out to be yours. I will not defend it. I only want to say one thing, and then I will be silent as long as you like." "Say it." "I did not do it to deceive you into marrying me. I did it because I'm a coward about one particular thing." His voice was not steady, and he let it not be. "You were the first person in 2 years who talked to me as though I were a man with a coat and a horse, and every day it got harder, not easier, because every day there was more of it to lose, the kitchen, and your list, and Miss Drusilla asleep by the fire, and you telling me in February that the third thing was impossible. And I sat there with £200 in my pocketbook and said that is a great pity, and I have hated myself for 11 days over it, and I still said nothing, because the moment I said it the woman who tells me the truth would be gone, and I should have a duchess instead. That is the whole of my reasoning, and it is contemptible, and it is also exactly what happened. Clemency stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the lane in her apron with her hands at her sides, and the hedge coming into leaf on both sides of her, and she said, "Do you know what the worst of it is? It is not the deceit. My father used to say that every man has a locked drawer, and the wise wife knows where it is, and does not open it. It is not even that you let me marry you under a false description, though I understand from her ladyship that this may turn out to matter a great deal to lawyers. Then what? It is that you watched me be poor," she said, "for 4 months on purpose for your own pleasure." Cassian Marek stood in the lane and took that, and there was nothing whatever to say to it, because it was true. "I mended those frames pane by pane with broken glass at a penny a pound," she said. "You watch me do it. I walked to Belcaster and back 18 miles in January to buy seed at the right price, and you asked me at supper whether I had had a good day, and I said yes, and I had. I sat in that kitchen and told you I wanted a dispensary, and it wanted £200, and there was not a soul within 11 miles who had it, and you said that is a great pity, and you had it in your coat." Her chin came up, and her eyes were bright and furious and dry. "There are 4 children in the Boulais cottage who have had the cough since November. That is what your locked drawer cost, Cassian, not my feelings. I do not care about my feelings this morning. I have not got time for them. 4 in one bed, and the eldest is 9. Then she turned and walked on, and he did not follow her, because she asked him not to, and because a man who has been told a thing like that in a lane has no business anywhere, except standing exactly where he is. Miss Drusilla Ardley delivered her verdict that evening, in the parlor, in front of the fire that Ned had finally lit, having had the entire situation explained to her twice at considerable volume on account of her deaf ear. "You are a duke." "Yes, ma'am." "And you have been eating my niece's pastry in a kitchen for 4 months." "Yes." The old woman looked into the fire. "I shall tell you what I think," she said, "and it will not be what you expect, and then I shall go to bed, because I am 61 and this has been a very great deal. I think you are a fool, and I think you are not a liar, which are entirely different articles, and I have buried a husband and a brother, and I know the difference by the smell. A liar would have told her in the vestry and made a pretty story of it, a duke in disguise, the romance of it, all the world weeping into its handkerchief, and she would have been managed, and she has been managed enough. You did not tell her because you were frightened of losing something. That is not fraud. It is greed, which is commoner and more curable." She took up her candle. "But she is right about the Boulais children, and you had better understand that she will be right about it for years, and that when you are 80 she will still be right about it, and the only thing you can do is spend the rest of your life being useful at such a rate that the account cannot be added up. Good night, Your Grace." Clemency came back on the 12th day. He had not written to her, which took more strength than anything else he did that spring. He had sent no money, no carriage, no message. He had done, instead, 4 things, and he had done all of them without her knowledge and had them ready in writing, and he had made a resolution about the 5th. She came in a hired chaise at 4 in the afternoon with her aunt beside her, and she walked into the parlor at Nethercot still in her traveling cloak, and she said, "I have 3 conditions, and they are not negotiable, and if you agree to them, I will be your wife in fact and in the sight of everybody, and I will go to the Abbey, and I will not throw this in your face again in public as long as I live. That is what you get. Do you want to hear the price?" "Yes," said Cassian. First, the dispensary, not as a gift from you. I want it endowed out of the Halloway estate as of right, with a deed, with a subscription of a penny from every family that uses it and a paid surgeon 1 day in the week. And I want my name off it and my father's name on it, and I want it opened before the summer. It was conveyed on the 9th, said Cashin. 2 rooms and a stove in the old way house at Nether Halloway, endowed at £1,100 in the 3%, which yields 33 a year. And Mr. Sowerby of Belcaster has accepted the surgency at 40 guineas and has written to say, I have the letter, that he thinks a great deal better of me than he expected to. It is called the Ardley Dispensary. The deed is on the table behind you, and it wants your signature as a trustee, not mine. Clemency Ardley stood very still. Second, she said less steadily. Ask. I will not be taught. Not by her ladyship, not by a woman she recommends, not by anybody who was in this yard on the 4th of April. If I am to be a duchess, I shall be a bad one for 2 years, and I shall learn it from the housekeeper and the books and my own mistakes. And you will let me be laughed at, and you will not step in front of me to shield me, ever, because the moment you do that they will know I cannot stand alone, and they will never afterwards let me. Agreed, said Cashin, and I will find it the hardest thing you have asked me. Third, she undid the throat of her cloak with fingers that were not quite obedient. You will not lie to me again about anything at all, however small, however kindly meant, not about a letter or a debt, or a doctor's opinion, or a thing said about me at a dinner. Not once, because I have discovered in 11 days at my aunt's cousin's house in Taunton that I do not want to leave you, and that frightens me a great deal more than being poor did, and the only floor I can stand on is that. Cashin Merrick crossed the parlor of the farmhouse at Nethercot, and did not touch her. Agreed, he said, and here is the first installment, and you will not like it. The letter that came on the 4th said that the Nethercot purchase is voidable because I bought trust property under a false description, and Lady Sabine has put it before council, and it will go to Chancery. It also asked the committee to be informed by what description the Duke of Halloway was married in November. Quill warned me of that in the vestry, and I went out and did it anyway. So the plain truth this evening is that I may have made your marriage a question for lawyers, and I did it with my eyes open, and she knows it, and she will use it. Clemency looked at him for a long moment. Well, she said, that is much better. Now I know what we are doing. She took off the cloak at last and laid it over the chair. Send for the carriage in the morning. If they are going to argue about whether I am the Duchess of Halloway, I had rather be standing in the Abbey while they do it. Halloway Abbey had 41 windows on the south front, a hall paved in black and white marble, and a staff of 39, and every one of the 39 was drawn up in the hall on the morning of the 16th of April, when the carriage came round the sweep. Cashin had asked for it not to be done. Mrs. Ordway, the housekeeper, who was 66 and had been at the Abbey since she was 14, had heard him out with perfect courtesy, and had then done it anyway, because a duchess coming to her own house for the first time is not a matter upon which a mere duke's opinion is decisive. And Cashin, handing his wife down from the carriage, felt her hand close on his for exactly 1 second before she let go and went in alone, half a pace in front of him, which was the arrangement she had insisted upon in the chaise. She stopped in the middle of the marble floor. Mrs. Ordway, she said, I know 11 rooms and a kitchen and 2 servants, and I am told this house has 104 rooms and 39 of you, and I shall be a great deal of trouble to you for about a year. I have kept a physician's accounts since I was 13, and I can read a ledger, and I do not know one single thing about a house of this size. I should be very much obliged if you would teach me, and I should be more obliged if, when I do something absurd, you would tell me at once and privately, and not let me find it out at a dinner table. There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. "Your Grace," said Mrs. Ordway, "will take chocolate in the small breakfast room at 9, and I shall bring the household book at 10, and I shall want 3 hours." They had 4 hours that first day, and 3 hours a day for 11 weeks. Cashin used to hear them through the door of the steward's room. The housekeeper's slow, flat voice reciting the establishment, the linen, the plate, the still room, the precedence at table, the 41 families in the county, and what each of them was owed, and what each of them had done. And his wife's voice asking questions of a kind that no duchess in the history of Halloway had ever asked, such as what the laundry maids were paid, and whether it was enough, and what happened to them when they were 40. The county called. It called for 6 weeks solid, and it was very nearly as bad as Cashin had feared, and in exactly the ways he had not predicted. Nobody was rude. That was the mechanism, and he had lived among these people for 2 years and had still not fully mastered it. They were charming. They were so charming that within a fortnight there was a settled way of describing the new Duchess of Halloway which required no rudeness whatever. She was an original. She was so refreshing. She had the most extraordinary knowledge of herbs, quite the wise woman, and did his Grace know she had been seen in the village at 8 in the morning with a basket. And really, in these leveling times, one could not help admiring it, though of course one's own daughters. He learned the exact taste of it at the Pentreath's dinner in May, when Lady Pentreath, at the head of the table, asked his wife, with luminous kindness, whether it was true that she had been obliged to sell her poor father's library. Cashin's hand tightened on the stem of his glass. He had promised not to step in front of her. It was, as he had told her, the hardest thing she had asked him. "Quite true," said Clemency. "At Guthrie's rooms in Belcaster in November, and I sat in the second row and watched it, which I recommend to nobody. 200 volumes went for £18, and a herbarium of 22 years collecting went for £2.10. She put down her fork. "The only lot I could buy was 4 quarto volumes of his own manuscript daybooks, which were described in the catalogue as of no interest to the general purchaser, and I paid 11 shillings for them in coppers. I have them still. They are the best thing I own, and I would not sell them for the price of this house." Nobody at that table said one word for a moment. Then old Sir Hugo Pentreath at the foot, who was 78 and stone deaf, and had been a member of the Royal College for 50 years, said, "Day books. 19 years' practice in a spa town. Madam, you have a document. Bring it to me. Bring it to me on Tuesday." And that, as Cashin understood afterwards, was the true beginning of it. Not the marble hall and the 39 servants, but a deaf old physician wanting to see 4 quarto volumes. Lady Sabine Verrill dined at the Abbey on the 19th of May, having invited herself in a letter of such warmth that Clemency had read it twice and said, "She is going to do something at the table," and had been right. Cashin had by then understood a great deal more about his cousin's widow than he had in April, chiefly because he had done what he had spent his whole professional life doing, and had gone and read the accounts. Lady Sabine had been the wife of the 8th Duke's nephew. She had lived at the Abbey for 11 years as the effective mistress of it, since the 8th Duchess had died young. She had had the ordering of the house and the county's whole social calendar, and latterly, the administration of the Halloway Charitable Trust, 900 a year, 4 almshouses, a school, and the appointment of 2 chaplaincies. And then 2 boys had died at school, and an old man's heart had failed, and a cousin had eaten crayfish at Naples, and a land agent from Chidbury had inherited everything, and she had gone from the North Wing to a dower house at Verrill with 800 a year and 1 daughter. The daughter was Lady Georgiana Verrill, 27, handsome, silent, and Cashin discovered from a Bristol attorney in the 2nd week of May. at a cost of 9 guineas owed £19,000, in her own name, on post-obit bonds taken up between her 22nd and 25th years, to pay her mother's debts and her late father's. He told his wife the whole of it the same evening, because he had promised, and because he had discovered that telling her things was the great, unexpected luxury of his life. "Then she is not wicked," said Clemency. "She is drowning. She is trying to have your marriage annulled." "Yes, that is what drowning people do. She was mixing something in a mortar. She did not stop. It does not make her less dangerous. It makes her a great deal more dangerous, because a wicked woman may be bought off and a frightened one cannot. Cashin, does she know about the 19,000? She must. Then she believes that if Georgiana were Duchess of Halloway it would all be paid, and it would, and that is not greed. She would say it was a mother's duty, and she would half believe it." The pestle went round. How very tiresome! I had been looking forward to hating her. At dinner on the 19th, Lady Sabine waited until the second course, and then said, brightly, down the table, "Duchess, I am so glad you must settle a wager for us. Lady Pentreath insists that the Duchess of Halloway takes precedence of a marchioness's daughter, and I have said that it depends entirely upon whether the marriage is good, and of course nobody knows, and it is all the fault of these dreadful lawyers. What do you say?" 11 people stopped eating. Cashin did not step in front of her. He put both hands on the table and did not, and it cost him something he could feel in his jaw for 2 days afterwards. "I say that it will be decided by men in wigs in about 18 months, said Clemency, "and until then I shall go in to dinner behind Lady Pentreath, who is 69 and has a bad hip and ought to be sitting down first in any case." She turned to the footman. "The soup is going cold at your ladyship's end. Would you take it away?" Lady Sabine laughed, a genuine, delighted, entirely unforced laugh, and said, "Oh, well done," and did not attack again for 6 weeks. And Cashin went to bed that night knowing that his wife had won a skirmish, and that the war had not been engaged at all. The fever came in July, at Halloway Ford. It began in the almshouses, 4 cottages under one roof at the bottom of the village, trust property, 11 old people. And by the 4th day there were 9 cases in the almshouses and the Ford, and 2 in the tan-yard cottages. And Dr. Pentreath, the younger, had come over from Belcaster, and pronounced it a low continued fever arising from the exhalations of the marsh ground, and had ordered the windows shut and vinegar burned, and the almshouse pump used for everything, since the marsh water was plainly the seat of the trouble. Clemency was at the Ford within 2 hours of the first message, and did not come home for 11 days. Cashin saw her at intervals during those 11 days. At 4 in the morning in the Abbey kitchen eating standing up, at midnight in the still-room making up a solution of 11 grains to the ounce. On the 5th day, sitting on a wall at the Ford with her eyes shut and her hands shaking, refusing to be driven home. She did not nurse. She had said flatly on the first day that she was not a nurse, and that 2 women in the village were better at it than she would ever be, and had paid them. What she did was walk the village with her father's marbled notebook and a pencil. 9 cases, she said to him on the 6th day, spreading a sheet of paper on the Abbey library table with the lamps lit. "Look at them. This is not a map of the marsh. This is a map of a pump." He looked, and he had spent 12 years reading plans of drainage and watercourses, and he saw it in 11 seconds. Every case is in a house that draws from the almshouse pump. Every single one. 9 houses, 9 cases. And these 4 cottages here are 20 feet nearer the marsh than the almshouses, and there is not one case in them, and they draw from the spring by the chapel. And here, her finger went down, the tan-yard soakaway, 11 feet from the almshouse wellhead, uphill of it, and the tanner told me himself it has been taking the pit's washings for 19 years and was rebuilt in the spring with land drain pipe, because the old sump was full. She looked up at him. Dr. Pentreath has ordered them to shut the windows and drink out of that pump. He has been ordering it for 6 days. If he is right and I am wrong, nobody is any worse for boiling their water. If I am right and he is wrong, and that pump is not shut this evening, somebody in one of those cottages is going to die on Sunday. Then it will be shut this evening, said Cashin. It is trust property, said Clemency. The almshouses, the pump, the well, all of it. It is administered by the committee in London and locally by the visitor's deputy, who is Lady Sabine Verrill, and she has already written to Mr. Hurdle to say that no alteration of any kind is to be made to trust property upon the authority of a person whose position in this family is a matter of legal doubt. The two of them looked at one another across the library table for a moment. How long to sink a new well, said Cashin. 9 days in that ground, if you had 11 men. You shall have 18. Hurdle shall have every man off the harvest in the home fields, and I will take the loss. He was already writing. The pump will be capped tonight by me personally, as visitor, and if there is an action for it, she may bring it against me and welcome, and a duke breaking a lock on his own charity's pump head with a hammer in front of the whole village will be very much the most useful thing I have ever done with the title. And Clemency, he looked up. Write it out, all of it. The 9 houses, the 4 that were spared, the soakaway, the dates in your own hand, and sign it, and have Hurdle and the tanner witness the measurements. Not for the lawyers, for old Sir Hugo. Send it to him tonight. She sent it that night. Sir Hugo Pentreath, aged 78, read it in the morning, drove 11 miles in his own gig with his son sitting beside him in absolute silence, walked round the almshouses at Halloway Ford with a stick, put his nose over the tan-yard soakaway, and then went and stood in front of the capped pumphead with his hat off, in front of about 40 people, and said, at the volume of a very deaf man, "The Duchess is right and my son is a fool, and I shall say so to the County Medical Society in October." There were 2 more cases and no deaths. The new well was sunk in 8 days. And on the last of the 11 days, when it was clearly over, Cashin went down to the ford at 6 in the evening, and found his wife asleep on a settle in the almshouse kitchen, with an old woman's hand held in both of hers. And he sat down on the floor beside the settle without waking her, and stayed there for an hour. And that was the evening he stopped being able to imagine his life without her in it, which was a different and much more frightening thing than anything he had felt in Belcaster. Mr. Peregrine Locksley came to the Abbey on the 4th of September, and asked for the Duke, and was shown in, and he had a portfolio under his arm. He was thinner than he had been in the pump room, and his coat was very good and a year out of date, and he came in with the particular jauntiness of a man who has rehearsed. "Your Grace, you will not remember me, Locksley Peregrine Locksley of Belcaster. We were, in a manner of speaking, in the same room once," he smiled. "I have come about the agency of the Chidmarsh Farms, which I understand falls vacant at Michaelmas. I have some knowledge of accounts and a great deal of local connection, and I flatter myself that a word from the right quarter—" "You have no knowledge of accounts," said Cashin, "and your local connection is that your wife's grandfather's bank ruined 300 people in the town you were born in. Why are you really here?" The smile stayed on for a second longer than it should have, and then came off like a hat. "Because I have £1,100 of my wife's grandmother's money, and a house I cannot keep up, and a father-in-law in the Fleet," said Locksley. "And because you have 104 rooms, and because your wife was engaged to me for 11 months, and I have 4 letters in her hand in this portfolio, and I have been sitting up at night for 3 weeks working out whether I am the kind of man who would use them." He put the portfolio on the table with a good deal of care, as though it were hot. "And I am not," he said. "It turns out. I have found that out this morning in the sweep, looking at the front of this house. It is a considerable disappointment. I had rather counted on being that kind of man. It seemed to be the only professional opening left to me." Cashin looked at him for a long moment. "What is in them?" "Nothing," said Locksley wretchedly. "That is the joke of it. Nothing at all. She was 23, and she wrote to me about her father's plates and the price of glass, and whether she ought to read Latin, and there is not one line in 4 letters that she would be ashamed to have read out in a church. She was never anything but exactly what she looked like, and I threw her over in a public room for £40,000 that did not exist, and I have been married 11 months to a woman who was in that room and watched me do it." He pushed the portfolio an inch further across the table. "Take them. Burn them. I did not come to sell them, whatever I told myself on the road. I came because I wanted somebody to say out loud that I was not always contemptible, and there is nobody left in Belcaster who will." Cashin did not take the portfolio. "Sit down," he said. "Your Grace." "Sit down, Mr. Locksley. You will not have the Chidmarsh agency. You are not fit for it, and I do not give away 1,100 acres to soothe anybody's conscience, including my own." He rang the bell. "But there is a clerkship in the estate office at £90 under Mr. Quill, who is the hardest man in 3 counties, and will make you wish you had never learned to write. You will be examined on Thursday. If you cannot keep a set of books by Christmas, he will turn you off and I shall not interfere. And you will bring your wife to the Abbey on the 20th, because my wife has been asking for 11 months who bought her father's herbarium, and I have this week found out. And it was Miss Arabella Hensley, at £2.10, in the yard at Guthrie's, 4 minutes after the sale, out of her own pocket money, and she has had it in a spare bedroom ever since, and has never said a word about it to anybody." Peregrine Locksley sat down very suddenly. "She never told me that," he said. "No," said Cashin. "I should think she has not told you a great many things." Arabella Locksley came to the Abbey on the 20th of September, with a cabinet of 9 drawers, roped to the back of a hired cart. She was 22 and plain and quiet, and had the flattest, driest voice Cashin had ever heard out of a young woman, and she stood in the marble hall and said to Clemency, without any preliminaries whatsoever, "I bought it because I had watched him drink your aunt's tea, and because £2.10 was what I had, and because I could not think of anything else to do. I am aware that it is the sort of thing that makes the person who does it feel better and helps nobody. I have been ashamed of it for 11 months. It is in the cart." There was a silence, and then Clemency crossed the hall and took both her hands. "9 drawers," she said. "There are 340 sheets in it, and he collected them over 22 years, and I could not raise £2.10. Mrs. Locksley, I do not care in the least what you were ashamed of. Come and see the walled garden, and I shall tell you what is in drawer 6. They were in that garden 4 hours. Cashin, going by at some point in the afternoon, heard from the far side of the wall the sound of 2 women laughing, and one of them was his wife, and he stood in the lane for a moment like a man warming his hands. The Halloway ball was on the 11th of October, and it was Mrs. Ordway's idea, and Cashin resisted it for 3 weeks. "There has not been a ball at the Abbey for 12 years, the housekeeper said immovably. "Not since the Duchess died. Her ladyship gave assemblies at the Ford and card parties, but not a ball in this house, because it was not hers to give. It is her Grace's to give. And the county has spent 6 months deciding what she is, your Grace, and it has very nearly decided, and if it decides in this hall with the chandeliers lit it will decide right." So they gave a ball, and 211 people came, which was every soul invited and 4 who were not. Cashin remembered afterwards a great many small things about that night, and one large one. He remembered his wife coming down the great staircase in dark green silk, with her mother's garnets and no other jewel, having sent back the Halloway diamonds to the strong room with a note to him saying that a woman who is going to be laughed at should not be laughed at in £9,000 worth of somebody else's stones. He remembered old Sir Hugo Pentreath standing in the middle of the hall booming at anybody who came within reach about the almshouse pump and the tan-yard soakaway, and the paper her Grace was to read to the medical society. He remembered Arabella Locksley at the edge of the room in grey, being talked to kindly by Miss Drusilla, and Peregrine Locksley in the card-room, not playing, holding a tray of glasses because he had not been able to think what else to do with himself. And he remembered standing on the 4th step of the staircase at midnight, above 211 people, and saying the thing he had been composing for 6 months. "I'm obliged to you all for coming, and I shall be brief, because there is a supper. Some of you have been kind enough to be puzzled about my marriage, and 1 or 2 of you have been kind enough to be puzzled about it loudly, and I would rather you had it from me than from the county." He put his hand on the banister. "I met my wife in the pump room at Belcaster last October, on the morning she was thrown over in public by a young man who had written to a richer girl's father. She was carrying a portfolio of botanical plates that are better than anything in my library, drawn by a woman who has had no instruction since she was 15. Her father's whole estate was sold at auction in November for less than the price of one of my hunters, and the only lot she could afford was 11 shillings worth of his handwriting. I asked her to marry me 4 days after we met, without telling her who I was, because I was a coward, and she found it out in April from a stranger in the yard of a farmhouse while she was shelling peas. She has never once mentioned it in company since, which is a greater delicacy than I deserve, so I shall mention it myself here in front of all of you, and I shall say the rest of it too. In July there was fever at Halloway Ford. 9 cases. My wife walked that village for 11 days with a notebook and found that every case drew from 1 pump, and that the tan-yard soakaway lay 11 feet uphill of the wellhead, and she was told by a physician that she was a foolish woman meddling with miasmas, and she wrote it out and signed it, and was proved right by Sir Hugo Pentreath in front of 40 people, and there were no deaths. There are 4 in the Bolighs cottage at Nether Halloway who had the cough for a winter, because I sat in a kitchen with £200 in my coat, and let her tell me a dispensary was impossible. That is on my account and not on hers, and I shall be paying it off for 30 years. So, there has been a good deal of discussion as to whether the Duchess of Halloway is an original. She is not. She is the most exactly and inconveniently accurate person any of you will ever meet, and I would not exchange her for the whole of the peerage, and any man in this hall who cannot manage that had better shake my hand at the door and not come back. Now go to supper." There was a silence of about 2 seconds' duration, and then old Sir Hugo Pentreath began to applaud in the middle of the marble floor with his stick under his arm, very slowly and very loudly, being far too deaf to know that nobody else had started, and by the 4th clap the whole hall had come in behind him, and it went on for a long time. Cashin came down the last 3 steps and found his wife at the bottom with her hand out, and she was not crying, and her chin was up. "You promised," she said unsteadily, "never to step in front of me." "I did not step in front of you. I stepped behind you and shouted." "That," said the Duchess of Halloway, "is a distinction of quite disgraceful subtlety, and I shall allow it once." And she put her hand in his, and they went in to supper in front of 211 people, and she held on rather harder than she needed to all the way. It was a very great deal later, in the long gallery with the candles guttering, and the house finally quiet, that he told her the other thing he had been keeping, The last of it, the small one, kept back for 6 months not out of cowardice, but out of a fear so absurd that saying it aloud nearly choked him. That he had never once, in the garden at Belcaster, or the vestry at St. Ninian's, or 11 months of Nethercot and the Abbey, said that he loved her, because he had told her on the day he proposed that he did not, and he had been unable to find a way of taking it back that would not make her doubt everything else he had ever said. She listened to the whole of it. Then she said, "Cassian, you capped that pump with a hammer." "That is not an answer." "It is the only kind of answer I trust," said Clemency, and put her hand up to his face. And after that there were no more words about it at all, and the candles in the long gallery went out one by one and were not replaced. The claim was served on the 2nd of December. It came in the end in the flattest possible way. A clerk in a gig, at 11 in the morning, with 2 sealed papers and a receipt to be signed, and Cassian signed it standing in the gun room because the hall was being scrubbed. The first paper was a bill in Chancery in the matter of the Halloway Charitable Trust, the conveyance of Nethercot, the false description, the prayer that the sale be set aside, and the Duke of Halloway removed from the visitorship of his own family's charity. He had expected it since April. The second was a petition to the Committee for Privileges of the House of Lords, at the instance of Mr. Rufus Cadle, gentleman, of Bristol, praying that the said Cadle be declared entitled to the dukedom of Halloway, on the ground that the marriage solemnized at Guernsey in the year 1789 between the late Mr. Edward Marrick, surgeon in the Navy, and Miss Honor Trevik, spinster, was null and void for want of banns, license, or the presence of a lawfully ordained minister, the same having been celebrated in a private house by a person purporting to be a chaplain of the fleet, and that consequently the said Edward Marrick's only son, the person now styling himself Duke of Halloway, was not born in lawful wedlock and could inherit nothing whatever. Cassian read it twice in the gun room, and then went and sat down on the window seat, because his legs had stopped being reliable. His mother had been Honor Trevik of Chidbury. His father had been Edward Marrick, surgeon, of the Nautilus. They had been married at Guernsey in the November of '89, in a private house in the town of St. Peter Port, because a naval surgeon in a war has no time for banns. And his mother had told him about it perhaps 40 times in her life, on wet afternoons in a cottage on £80 a year. The rain, the borrowed gown, the chaplain who had a cold, the 2 witnesses, one of them a young surgeon off another ship whose name Cassian had heard, he was almost certain, and could not for the life of him now recall. She had died when he was 29. He had buried her at Chidbury, and every paper she had owned had gone into a deal box, and the deal box had gone into the roof of the agent's house at Chidbury, and the agent's house at Chidbury had burned to the ground in the March of the year. He became Duke of Halloway, with 11 years of his own papers in it, and he had stood in the lane and watched it, and thought only that he had lost his letter books. "There is no marriage certificate," said Quill that evening in the library with the 2 papers on the table between them. "I have known it since the day you succeeded, and I have had 4 men looking for 2 years. The Guernsey register for that house has never been found. There was no parish register because it was not a parish. The chaplain died at sea in '94. There were 2 witnesses. One was a woman of the house, and she is dead. The other was a surgeon, and we have never had his name." Cadle, a grocer's son from Bristol with a real claim and no money, put up by an attorney named Soden who is being paid by somebody else, and I will give you 3 guesses and you will only need one. Quill's face was gray. "It is a good claim, your grace. That is what I have to tell you. Not a nuisance. A good one. The burden is on you to prove the marriage, and you cannot prove it. And if you cannot prove it, then you are not Duke of Halloway and never were." And every act you have done as Duke is void, including the Nethercott conveyance, including the dispensary endowment, and including, in the view of counsel, whom I have consulted this afternoon, and who was very sorry indeed, any question as to the validity of your marriage in November. Since a marriage under a false description is voidable at the instance of a person with an interest, and Mr. Cadle would have the interest. Cashin sat in his own library, with a fire burning, and 11,000 books behind him. "Say the rest of it," he said. "You have been holding one back since the porch. You always do." "The rest of it," said Quill, "is that counsel advises you to send her Grace away." He told her the whole of it that night, in the small breakfast room, with both papers on the table, including the sentence about counsel's advice, because he had promised her in a farmhouse parlor in April that he would never keep back anything at all. She read the petition twice. Then she said, "What is the reasoning for sending me away?" "That if the marriage is questioned, and you are living here as my wife, and being called Duchess, then every day you remain strengthens Cadle's case that I have been holding myself out as something I am not, and weakens yours if it ever comes to a suit for nullity. And that if I am not the Duke of Halloway, then you are the wife of a land agent with about £1,100 in the world, and you would be entitled to say that you married a description and not a man, and counsel is of opinion that you should be put in a position to say it." He made himself finish. "There is a deed. He has drawn it. It provides for you and your aunt for life out of my own funds, whatever happens, and it recites that you entered the marriage in ignorance and reserve all your rights. It is in that drawer. I have not signed it, and I am not going to ask you to read it." "Give it to me." He gave it to her. She read it standing by the fire 4 pages, in a clerk's hand, and then folded it in half and in half again, and put it into the fire, and held it down with the poker until it had gone. "Now," said Clemency, "let us be practical, because I have had 11 months of practice at being ruined, and you have had none. If you are not the Duke of Halloway, what are you?" "A land agent with a good name in 3 counties, and £1,100. There is a marquis in Wiltshire who would take me back in a week." "At what?" "400 a year and a house." "400 a year," said his wife, "and a house. Cashin, I was to have had £18 and my board at Ripon, and I was to send 9 of the 18 to my aunt." She put the poker back. "Do you understand what you have just described to me? You have described a competence. A house with a garden and 400 a year, and a man who can get work anywhere between here and Salisbury. If the whole of this goes against us, I shall lose 104 rooms I cannot manage and 39 servants I am frightened of, and a county that calls me an original, and I shall keep a dispensary I have already endowed and a husband in my father's cabinet, and I shall be, on the plainest arithmetic, £400 a year better off than I was in November." She turned round. "So do not sit there offering me deeds. The only thing in that petition that can hurt me is the sentence about the marriage, and I will tell you now what I think about that, once, and then we need not discuss it again. If a court in England tells me in 18 months that I am not married to you, I shall go and be married to you again the following morning in Nether Halloway Church, under whatever name you have got left, in front of the whole village, and I shall enjoy it a great deal more than the first time, because the first time I was frightened and did it for a roof." Cashin Marek put his hands over his face, which he had not done since his mother died. "That is not the courageous half," she said more gently. "Here is the courageous half. I want you to promise me that you will not throw this away out of shame. You are perfectly capable of it. You have a taste for being nobody, Cashin. I have watched it. There will be a morning in the next 6 months when it will be easier to let Mr. Cadle have the whole thing and go and be a land agent and be honest and be quiet, and it will feel like humility, and it will be the worst thing you have ever done, because it is not yours to give away. It belongs to Hurdle and Mrs. Ordway, and the Ford, and the dispensary, and 1,100 people who cannot appeal to any committee about anything. You did not marry a duke. No, said Clemency. I married a man who read 14,000 acres worth of accounts for 11 days without being asked. That is what a duke is, when it is anything at all. Now let us go to bed, and in the morning you will send for Mr. Quill, and I want the whole of your mother's story written down before you forget one more word of it, and I do not care if it takes 9 sheets. The winter was long. The chancery suit went forward in a series of steps so slow and so expensive that Cashin came to think of it as weather. The petition to the Committee for Privileges was set down, and then adjourned, and then set down for the following June. Depositions were taken at Bristol and at Chidbury, and this was the worst of them at Guernsey, where a commissioner sat for 9 days in a hired room in St. Peter Port, and heard 4 old people say that they remembered nothing whatever. And the county, which had made up its mind at a ball in October, began by degrees to unmake it, because there is nothing so corrosive to a reputation as doubt about a name. Invitations came addressed to Mrs. Merrick. Twice they came addressed to the Duke of Halloway with the word Duke crossed through by some hand at the receiving end, which Cashin did not show his wife, and which she found in the fireplace anyway. 2 families stopped calling. A third called and asked, with a species of ghoulish sympathy, what her grace, or, well, one hardly knew, did one propose to do. Sir Hugo Pentreath, aged 78, drove 11 miles every 3rd Tuesday all winter, in the gig, in the wet, to sit in the library and shout at Clemency about her almshouse paper, which she read to the County Medical Society in Bristol in the February, and which was printed in the summer. And Cashin never afterwards heard the old man's name without wanting to take his hat off. Arabella Locksley came every week. Miss Drusilla, who had gone to live at the Ford in a cottage with a woman to do for her, walked up twice a week in all weathers and said things at the dinner table that nobody else dared to. And Peregrine Locksley kept his clerkship, having been examined by Quill in December, and found, to everybody's surprise including his own, to have a genuine head for figures and no ambition left whatever, which Quill said was the ideal composition of a clerk. Lady Sabine Verrill came on the 9th of March. She came alone in the Dower House chaise, and she sat down in the library in the same chair she had sat in as mistress of that house for 11 years, and she said, without any of the brightness at all, I have come to make you an offer, and I am going to make it badly, because I have not slept for a fortnight. Mr. Cadle's attorney is a man named Soden, and he is paid by me. Not by the trust. There is nothing wrong with the trust's books, and you may look at them. By me, out of the Verrill estate, at the rate of about 400 a year, which I have not got. If I stop paying him, Cadle stops, because Cadle is a grocer's son of no fortune whatever, and he has been told he is doing the will of Providence. She looked at her hands. I will stop, and the petition will be withdrawn before June, and the chancery suit with it, on one condition, and the condition is £19,000. Georgiana, said Cashin. You know then. The small, exquisite head came up. £19,400 on post-obit bonds at 5 and 6%, taken up by my daughter between her 22nd and 25th years, to pay her father's debts and mine. She was of age, and she signed them, and she never told me until they came for the plate. She is 27, and she has not had one new gown in 3 years, and she has refused 2 men because she cannot go to them owing £19,000, and she will be 40 before anybody can be told. Her voice did not break. It went, if anything, flatter. So yes, I have spent 2 years trying to have you unmade, and I began it before I ever laid eyes on your wife, and I would have done it if you had married an archbishop's daughter. It was never contempt, your grace. It was £19,000. There was a long silence in the library. Then Clemency Merrick, who had been sitting at the far window with a book she had not turned a page of in 10 minutes, got up and came, and stood behind her husband's chair with her hand on the back of it. "No," she said. Lady Sabine looked at her. "You will pay it," Clemency said, "and you will not withdraw anything." "I do not understand you." "Then attend, because it is not complicated." Clemency's hand tightened on the chairback. "If Mr. Cadle's petition is withdrawn because a bargain was made in this room in March, then for the rest of our lives every person in this county will know that the Duke of Halloway bought off a claim to his own title for £19,000, and they will all conclude that the claim was good. That is worth nothing to us. It is worse than nothing. And my husband cannot buy a decision from the House of Lords. If he tried it, he would deserve to lose." She looked down at the small woman in the chair. "But Lady Georgiana Verrill is my husband's cousin's daughter, and she owes £19,000 because she was 23 and would not see her mother sold up, and that has nothing whatever to do with the petition. It is family. So it will be paid this month, in full, out of the Halloway estate, whether we win in June or lose, and if we lose, Mr. Cadle may complain of it to whom he pleases, and I shall enjoy reading his letter. And you will go on paying Mr. Soden, and you will lose in June, and you will have to live in this county afterwards knowing that you took it." Lady Sabine Verrill sat quite still for perhaps 11 seconds. "That is the cruelest thing anybody has ever done to me," she said. "Yes," said Clemency. "I have thought about it for 6 months, and it is the best I could contrive." She went, and she did not withdraw the petition, and the £19,400 was paid on the 28th of March by Quill's draft on Coutts, and Lady Georgiana Verrill wrote 3 lines of acknowledgment so stiff that they were nearly illegible. And Cashin, who had by that time understood that he had married a woman with a strain of iron in her that he would spend his life admiring and occasionally fearing, went out and walked 4 miles in the dark. The pocketbook came out on the 4th of April, exactly a year after the yard at Nethercott, and it came out because of a thing his wife said at breakfast. "Volume 1 is not there," she said. "I have been through the 4 quartos 11 times for Mr. Quill, and they begin in the January of '95, when he set up at Belcaster. Before that he was 8 years at sea, and he kept a book, a little thing bound in limp vellum with a green ribbon, and he called it his first book, and he used to read me out of it when I was small. Storms and amputations and a monkey somebody had. It was not in the sale. I have gone through Guthrie's catalogue with my finger, and it is not in any lot I can identify, and it was not in the house at Cross Street when we gave up the lease, because I packed every book myself." Cashin set down his cup. "Lot 19, he said. "What?" He went to the strong room and came back with the pocketbook he had carried in the brown coat, and turned to a page in pencil, and read it out. "A parcel of miscellaneous manuscripts, sea journals, log books, and printed pamphlets, in a deal box, sold 3 shillings to Trescott, grocer, 4 Street. I took the whole of Guthrie's book down that morning," he said. "Every lot and every purchaser. I did it because I had watched a herbarium go for £2.10, and I could not think what else to do." He was already at the bell. "Trescott, a grocer. In 4 Street, Belcaster, 16 months ago, 3 shillings, a deal box of manuscript." Clemency had gone entirely white. "Cashin," she said, "a grocer buys manuscript by the box for one reason." Peregrine Locksley went to Belcaster on the 5th of April, and was there 9 days, and Cashin did not go with him, on Quill's advice, because a duke in a grocer's back shop would put the price of everything in the county up by a factor of 4. He wrote every evening. The letters got shorter. On the 6th, Trescott alive, 62, remembers the box, used it for wrapping and for lighting the copper, has been through it these 15 months. On the 7th, about a third remains. He will not take money, he is a decent old man and horrified. On the 8th, 41 leaves loose in the bottom of the box and one cover of limp vellum with a green ribbon, no book. Some leaves burnt at the edge. Am sorting them on his counter by candle. On the 9th, nothing. On the 10th, nothing. On the 11th of April, at 4 in the afternoon, Locksley came up the sweep at Halloway Abbey on a hired horse he had ridden into a lather, and came into the hall without waiting to be announced, hatless, with his coat open, holding a piece of paper between two boards tied round with string. 14th of November, he said, and had to stop and get his breath. 1789, St. Peter Port, Your Grace, sir, it is all in it. The house, the street, the woman of the house, the chaplain's name and his ship. And then he copied the certificate into the book, the whole of it, word for word, because he copied everything. He was that sort of man. And at the bottom he has put down that he signed as second witness, and he has written his own name out 3 times over practicing the flourish because he was 1 and 20. Cashin Marek took the boards in both hands, and could not for a moment untie the string. "Read it," said Clemency from the stairs, in a voice he did not recognize. "Read out what my father wrote." Locksley did not need the paper. He had plainly had it by heart for 2 hours. This day stood witness at the marriage of Mr. Edward Marek, surgeon of the Nautilus, to Miss Honor Trevik of Chidbury, at the house of Mrs. Lefever in Berthelot Street, the Reverend Josiah Sackville, chaplain of His Majesty's ship Perseverance, officiating, and Mrs. Lefever and myself the witnesses. Mr. Sackville entered the same in his chaplain's register in my sight before we drank the bride's health, and told me he had rather lose his hand than leave a marriage unregistered, at which the bridegroom laughed. I have set the certificate down here entire, being resolved to keep a book that will answer questions after I am dead. The chaplain's register of His Majesty's ship Perseverance was found on the 29th of April in the Navy Office in London, in a bundle of 11 such books tied with tape and docketed in 1802, and not untied since, at the back of a press on the 2nd floor, by a clerk of 19 named Bassett, who was given 4 sovereigns for it, and told to say nothing, and said nothing for 11 days, which Cashin considered the single most remarkable act of discretion in the whole affair. Entry the 11th in a small clerical hand. Nov. 14th, 1789. Edward Marek, surgeon of the Nautilus, bachelor, and Honor Trevik, of Chidbury in the county of Wilts, spinster, married by me at St. Peter Port in the island of Guernsey by license of the Dean, witnesses Marie Lefever and William Ardley. Jos. Sackville, chaplain. By license of the Dean. That was the sentence that ended it, and neither Quill nor Cashin nor anybody else had thought of it in 2 years, because they had all been looking for an English parish register, and there had never been one to find. The island had its own ecclesiastical court and its own dean and its own licenses, and the dean's register for the year '89 was produced by the 2nd week of May, and there it was again, in a 3rd place, in a clerk's Latin. The Committee for Privileges sat on the 11th of June, and it took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Cashin sat through it in a plain dark coat with his hands on his knees. He was asked 9 questions and gave 9 answers. Mr. Rufus Cadle, grocer's son, of Bristol, aged 34, sat at the other end of the room and looked, from the first minute, like a man watching a house fall down. And when the register and the certificate and a certain leaf of a naval surgeon's private journal, mounted between glass, had been laid before their lordships and read, he stood up before his own counsel could stop him, and said, in a flat Bristol voice, that he wished to withdraw, and that he begged the committee to understand that he had been told there was no register anywhere in the world, and that he had been told it by a gentleman who had come to his shop. The petition was dismissed. Mr. Soden, attorney, was made the subject of certain observations by the Lord Chairman which effectively ended his practice. And the whole thing was in the newspapers within 4 days, and Cashin discovered that his own vindication interested him about as much as a wet Tuesday, and that the only line he read twice was the one at the end of the 3rd paragraph. The said marriage having been established beyond question by the private journal of a naval surgeon, the late Mr. William Ardley of Belcaster, purchased at the sale of his effects for 11 shillings by his daughter, now Duchess of Halloway. He cut that paragraph out with a penknife on the mail coach going home, and had it framed, and it hung in the small breakfast room at Halloway Abbey for 51 years. The Chancery suit was compromised in the July, and it was compromised on terms that Cashin proposed himself, and that made his London counsel unhappy for a fortnight. He did not defend the Nethercot conveyance. He admitted the concealment, in writing, in 9 lines, and set the sale aside, and paid the trust the difference between his own valuation and a fresh one made by 2 strangers, which came to £410, and which he was glad to pay. And then he resigned the visitorship of the Halloway Charitable Trust, the appointment his family had held for 140 years, and had the trust deed altered, at his own expense, so that the committee should thereafter consist of the incumbent of Nether Halloway, the surgeon of the Ardley dispensary, 2 persons elected annually by the subscribers, and 1 nominee of the Duke of Halloway, who should have 1 vote out of 5 and no casting voice. "You are giving away the only real power the family has in this valley," Quill said. "I am giving away the power to be lied to about it," said Cashin. "I have had 2 years of what happens when 900 a year is administered by a committee in London that has never seen the buildings, and 11 months of what happens when it is administered locally by a frightened woman with a daughter in debt, and my wife has had 11 days of walking a village with a notebook, because a pump could not be capped without my breaking the lock. 1 vote out of 5, Quill. Write it." They were married again on the 9th of September, in the parish church of Nether Halloway, and it was not necessary, and Cashin never once pretended that it was. Counsel had advised, in the end, that there was no defect at all. The description in the affidavit had been true so far as it went. There had been no fraud upon any 3rd person, and no living creature now had any interest in questioning it. But Clemency had said a thing in the small breakfast room in December, standing by the fire with a burnt deed in the grate, and Cashin had gone to sleep with it in his head and woken up with it there for 9 months. So they had the banns read 3 Sundays running Cashin Marrick, of this parish, and Clemency his wife, both of full age, which caused a certain amount of learned correspondence in the diocese and a great deal of pleasure in the village. And on the 9th of September, the church at Nether Halloway held 411 people, and about 100 more in the churchyard. There was no coronet on anything. She came up the aisle in the same grey she had worn at St. Ninian's, led out at the waist by Mrs. Ordway's own hands with a good deal of muttering, carrying rosemary and late chrysanthemums out of the walled garden at Nethercot, on the arm of Mr. Peregrine Locksley, clerk to the estate office, because she had asked him herself, and because he had wept for 11 minutes when she did, and then had his coat brushed. Miss Drusilla Ardley wept audibly from the beginning of the service to the end of it, being by then 63 and thoroughly practiced. Sir Hugo Pentreath boomed the responses in the wrong places. Arabella Locksley held her friend's gloves. Hurdle the bailiff and Mrs. Ordway signed the register as witnesses, and Ned, who was 18 by then and second gardener, and had grown 11 inches since Belcaster rang the treble bell so hard that he had to be spoken to. And in the 4th pew from the front on the aisle sat Lady Sabine Verrill and her daughter, because Clemency had written the invitation herself in April, 4 days after the leaf came out of a grocer's box, and had shown it to Cashin before she sealed it. It was 11 lines long. It did not mention the petition, or the £19,000, or Mr. Soden. It said that the Duke and Duchess of Halloway would be married in Nether Halloway Church in September, and would be glad of the presence of the family. That Lady Georgiana was very much wanted, and that if her ladyship would prefer to come and say nothing to anybody and go away directly afterwards, a chair would be kept for her at the end of a pew where she could do it. She came and said nothing to anybody, and went away directly afterwards. But she came in November as well, to the opening of the new almshouse well, and in the February she sent down a paper of subscribers for the dispensary in her own hand with her own name at the head of it for 5 guineas, which was a great deal of money to a woman with 800 a year and a dower house. And she and Clemency were, in the end, not friends, but something the county found harder to account for and considerably more useful, which was allies. Lady Georgiana Verrill married a physician of Bristol in the spring of the 2nd year, at 29, in a new gown, owing nobody anything. The Ardley dispensary at Nether Halloway opened its doors on the 1st of June, and treated 409 persons in its first year, at a penny a week from every subscribing family, with Mr. Sowerby of Belcaster attending on Thursdays at 40 guineas and afterwards on Thursdays and Mondays at 80. In the 11th year it had 2 beds and a resident surgeon, and a subscription of £300, and it was copied at Belcaster, and at 2 other places in the county. And the printed report was headed, every year, with the words founded in memory of William Ardley, surgeon and physician of Belcaster, who kept a book that would answer questions after he was dead. The 4 quarto day books were bound in calf and put in the library at the Abbey, between the county histories and the Halloway muniments, and the 41 loose leaves out of the grocer's box were mounted between glass in 9 frames. And old Mr. Trescott of Fore Street was fetched out to see them at the Duke's expense in a postchaise, and given his dinner in the steward's room, and sent home with a hamper, and told everybody in Belcaster about it for the remaining 4 years of his life. The plates were published in the 4th year, 209 of them, engraved in Bristol at the Duke of Halloway's charge, and issued in 11 parts by subscription. A flora of the Belcaster country and the Halloway valley, with notes upon the uses of plants among the country people, by Clemency, Duchess of Halloway, and drawn from nature by the same hand. Her name went on it because she was past minding it by then, and because Sir Hugo Pentreath, aged 82, had said that if the plates went out anonymously, he would come to the Abbey and shout at both of them, and everybody believed him. She had that book in her hands for the first time in the walled garden at Nethercot, which they never gave up, and which they went to for 3 weeks every summer for the whole of their lives, the 11 cold rooms, the 2 servants, the smoking chimney, the well, the frame she had glazed with penny glass. Cashin used to say that it was the only house he had ever owned. She used to say that it was the only house he had ever earned, and then look at him over the top of her spectacles until he laughed. They had 3 sons and a daughter. The daughter, who came last and was small and fierce and had her mother's chin, was drawing plants under instruction at 9 years old, and had the grinding of colors by 11, and was taken by her father to Guthrie's rooms in Belcaster on her 12th birthday, at her own request, to be shown the 2nd row, and told the whole of it. The £18, and the £2.10, and the 11 shillings in coppers, and the 3 shillings that a grocer paid for a deal box, and how a family of 14,000 acres had once hung by a leaf of paper that had very nearly been used to wrap bacon. And that, Cashin would say to any of them, whenever the story came round again, is why we do not tell people what we are and let them find it out afterwards. There is a shorter reason as well. What is the shorter reason? His daughter asked him the first time. That your mother told me she would be watching whether I told her before she could have found it out or after, said Cashin Merrick. And I told her after, by 9 minutes, in a farmyard, while she was shelling peas. And I have been paying that off since the 4th of April in the year I married her, and I shall be paying it when I am 80, and it is the best bargain I ever made. He was 81 when he died at the Abbey in the October, with 41 windows on the south front, and the whole valley turned out in the lane. And his wife lived 9 years after him, at Nethercot, in 11 cold rooms with a walled garden, and was buried beside him at Nether Halloway under a stone that she had ordered herself and had inspected twice. It gave her name and the dates, and then, because she had left instructions with the mason in writing, and paid him in advance in case anybody argued about it afterwards, 5 words more. Daughter of William Ardley, surgeon.